morning, everyone. Happy Sabbath to you all. If you're like most people in Miami this week, you've been gearing up for a very, very exciting match that's going to happen today. How many of you know what's going on today? El Clásico. If you know what that is, you're not a fan of soccer. Today is El Clásico. We have Lionel Messi, Felix, right? And all they're going to play today in the stadium, and they're going to be fantastic. Now, personally, I'm not very big on soccer, football. It's a great sport. I love it. But I'm not as excited about that as I am about my sport, which is basketball. How many of you guys love basketball? Basketball, I love basketball. I'm a Heat fan, but I don't love just what happens on the court. I love what happens off the court. I especially love this off season because this is the time where everyone gets together and they figure out what's going to happen next. How are you going to gear up to face the Golden State Warriors next year? What moves are you going to make? How are you going to balance your salary cap? How is that going to work? I remember several years ago when LeBron James announced when he was going to come to Miami Heat. I lost my mind that day. It was amazing. Now, if you want to feel old, this last week, we also celebrated the 25th anniversary of something very special in the basketball community. Do you know what that was? Think, 25 years ago, this last week, what was going on? This was 1992. This was the Olympics in Barcelona. This was the start of a very special moment in basketball history. This was the beginning of a team that wasn't just like any other team. This was the Dream Team. How many of y'all remember the Dream Team? Let me brief you on this in case you're not old enough to appreciate what was going on. See, before 1992, the United States sent out college players to represent them in the Olympics. They didn't send professional athletes. They only sent college players. Now, college players, they sometimes did good, sometimes they didn't do that well, but 1988 was a very important year for basketball because the U.S. came in third place. They won the bronze medal in the Olympics that year. That was, I think, in South Korea, 1988. Now, who won the other two medals, you might ask? Silver was won by Yugoslavia. You might think, Yugoslavia had a team? Yeah, they had a squad. They beat the U.S. that year. But do you know who won the gold medal that year? This was 1988. The United Soviet States, the Russians, the Soviets won the gold medal. Believe it or not. Yeah, it's crazy. They won that year. 1988 happened, and you're like, what? The United States wondered something. Why aren't we sending our best players to there? But 1988, we have the NBA, we have some good players. Why aren't we sending the best? So the U.S. Men's Olympic Committee came to the NBA, and they said, hey, what do you think about sending us the best players? Listen, we lost to the Soviets. We have to get better. We already have better players. Let me ask you guys this. Can anyone here name a single person on this 1988 basketball team? Nobody? If you're good with eyes, you may realize that's Dan Marley on the top right. He played for the Heat back in the day. But he was in college back in the day. They weren't really that good. They won the bronze medal. But in comparison to the 1988 team, the 1992 team, this is the 1992 team. Arguably the best collection of talent, the best NBA team, the best basketball team on the planet. You have even people that don't know a whole lot of basketball might realize a gentleman over here, let me see here, by the name of Michael Jordan. That's Michael Jordan. This is Scottie Pippen. This is Patrick Ewing. This is Larry Bird. This is Magic Johnson. For some reason, this is Christian Laettner. I don't know what he was doing on the team. But this is David Robinson. This is Karl Malone. This is Charles Barkley. This is, what's his name? John Stockton. This is Clyde Drexler. This is Chris Mullin. Yes, he was on the Space Jam. He was on there. He was there. This was the best team that the United States ever put together. Amazing team. They came and they swept that team. They swept the entire Olympics. And it wasn't that they won it and just, they barely squeaked it out. They were blowing teams away. It wasn't even close. As a matter of fact, one of those opposing teams was this team. This was the head coach, Victorino Cunha. He said, we were hanging in there until they made a 46-1 run. Now, a 46-1 run in any sport is bad. Like, you're not coming back from that. That's 50 points ahead. And these people they were just beating everyone. Imagine Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan in their prime. I mean, they were killing it. But you know what? The other teams, they were getting blown away, and it didn't even matter. They were excited. Why do you think they were excited? It didn't matter if you were getting beat because you were on the same court as who? As Michael Jordan, as Magic Johnson, as Larry Bird. You're playing against arguably the all-time greatest team. It didn't matter you getting beat. You could tell your kids, I played against Michael. I was playing against him, and he crossed me over, and I broke my knees, broke my ankles, broke every single bone in my body, but it didn't matter. I was playing against Michael Jordan. Can you say that? You didn't say that. You didn't play against Michael Jordan. I did, and I lost by 50, and it was amazing. That was the dream team. It was amazing. It was this phenomenon. People were excited on the court, off the courts. Even the players and the opposing coaches were having them sign their shoes, and it was just an amazing team. 25 years ago, man. Yeah, you're old. I'm old. And they said that was this week. And I started thinking, I'm like, the dream team. The dream team is a really cool concept. Getting the best assortment of players, putting them on the court, on the field, what have you, and doing something special and blowing teams out of the water. And I started to think, and I said, you know what? What would it look like if God were to make a dream team? What would it look like if the church were to assemble its dream team? What would a dream team like that look like? Who'd be on that squad? You can imagine some pastors, maybe some great elders, some preachers. Who would be on that team? Start to wonder in your mind, who would be on that team? So today, as we're going to be looking at the message this morning, I'm going to talk about God's dream team. Do you know that God has in His Word who is God's dream team? His plan A and a plan B that ended up happening? We're going to study that today. Let me give you a basic synopsis of a basic player on God's team. Someone that officiates for God in the basic sense is called a priest. A priest is a designation for a religious person that doesn't just limit itself to Christian usage. There's other world religions that have had priests. In the basic sense, a priest here is a person whose office it is to perform religious rites and especially to make sacrificial offerings. This is someone in the basic sense that is on the team of the deity. In Christian usage, it has a certain nuance to it. It's a person ordained to be to the sacerdotal or pastoral office, or a member of the clergy, or a minister. And in hierarchical churches, it's a member of the clergy of the order next below that of the bishop, authorized to carry out the Christian ministry. Basically, it's someone that does the work on behalf of the deity, someone that takes advice and takes orders from the deity and then performs in the general public and population. Does that make sense? So it's basically someone that performs on behalf of it. Let's say, make it easy. So all the players on the Miami Heat, they're priests because they're performing on behalf of their coach, if you want to use that example. That's the basic gist of it. And so when I started thinking about, okay, priests in the Bible were folks that performed or did some sort of ministry function for Yahweh. Who were the first two priests in the Bible? And I started doing a little study. I said, who were the people that God first called as priests? And the study that I did was very interesting because I found some very interesting parallels in the first two priests that are mentioned in the Bible. Jumping here, the first example is in Genesis chapter 14, verses 17 through 19. Now, you may remember a gentleman by the name of Abraham, right? How many of you know Abraham? You may remember Abraham. Abraham is the father of faith. Many people know him. Now, Abraham, before he was known by the name of Abram. And when he was called Abram, he had his own business. He did many things. And in one of his stories, the Bible says, he went against 7 kings. And he fought against those 7 kings, and he destroyed those 7 kings because they had basically stolen his, they kidnapped his nephew. I think that's what it was. And he came through and he rescued his nephew. And after the battle, he shows up to this gentleman in the middle paragraph named Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a very mysterious figure in the Bible because there's not a lot said about him. But we do know about him are certain key elements. is that here it says that he was the king of Salem, and he brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of, what does it say there, everybody? Priest of the God Most High. And he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth." This gentleman by the name of Melchizedek, he was two things. He was a king, and he was also what? A priest. Let's say that again. He was a king, and he was a priest. It's important for us to establish that benchmark in our head, and you'll see why later on. The second mention that we have of a priest in the Bible is in the next book of the Bible. This is in Exodus. In Exodus, we see a man named Moses. You all remember Moses, right? Moses, Ten Commandments, Charleston Heston, split the Red Sea. Yes, that Moses. But this was before he became that liberator of the Israelites. At this point in Exodus chapter 3, he was a fugitive. He was in Midian because he'd killed an Egyptian years and years before, and he was basically living as this outlaw. He married a woman named Zipporah, and Zipporah was one of 7 daughters to a gentleman by the name of Jethro. And here's this story that we find of Jethro, or of Moses and Jethro. Who was Jethro? It says here, now Moses was tending to the flock of Jethro, his, what does it say everyone there? Father-in-law, the priest of Midian. So he wasn't just anyone else, he was the priest of Midian. He was the priest of this area, and he was also obviously a farmer because Moses was tending to his flocks. It says here, and he, being Moses, led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames and fire from within a bush. This is the start of that famous story that we know of Moses and the burning bush. But the interesting part here is this gentleman by the name of Jethro and his father-in-law being a priest of Midian. And I said, notice the comparison with these first two priests, the first two people that were connections with God. His father was a father-in-law, Moses' father-in-law was his father-in-law and also a priest, but a shepherd. The first two priests mentioned in the Bible have several characteristics that are very fascinating. First, they both served full-time in their profession and in their ministry. So Jethro was a full-time priest, but he was also full-time what? Shepherd. You're not a part-time shepherd. You need to take care of your sheep all the time, right? I mean, he had his family, his daughters would help to tend to the sheep, but he was that full-time. Melchizedek was a full-time what? He was a king, and he was also full-time priest. You can't govern half the time and have that be your side job. You have to be both full-time if you're going to be a good leader. He was a full-time priest and a full-time king. So they were priests full-time and had full-time jobs. Second thing that we notice is that they were on opposite ends of the social-economic spectrum. Whereas Jethro was a farmer, maybe he had some sheep, a few goats, whatever, maybe a lot, depending on what it was. He wasn't up in the totem pole of social society, but he was still a priest, right? You go to Melchizedek, though. Melchizedek was a king. Presumably, he would have a lot of rank, a lot of authority. He had people under him. He was king. So this tells me something very fascinating, that it doesn't matter if you're a shepherd, a lowly shepherd, or if you're a mighty king, you could still have a position of ministry for God. You can still do something for God. You can combine and do something special for the Lord. Age doesn't matter. Position doesn't matter. Stature doesn't matter. None of that matters. What matters is a willing heart. And these folks had it. More than that, these leaders, these priests, served God's leaders, being Abram and Moses, before they realized their own calling into ministry. And so they served to help direct their path. And finally, this is important theologically, they're mentioned as priests before the establishment of the covenant in Sinai. Now, this is important theologically because there seems to be a misconception among many people that read the Bible today, thinking that, well, priests were not established until Sinai happened, and that's when God made this covenant with Israel. But that's not true. According to this, we have priests found in Genesis and in Exodus right before the Sinai covenant. And this is important. You'll see why. So, as I see these two figures, Melchizedek and I see Jethro, who would you think would be eligible to be part of God's team? Hold that thought. So, this is the text for this morning. This is God's dream team. When we look at who God would choose to be part of his dream team, the best collection of people on the planet, to be his players, to be his priests, who would he choose? We find here in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. God says to Moses, he says, relay this message to the children of Israel. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations, you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the, does anyone know how that text finishes? The Levites. Amen. Gotcha. It's not Levites. Anyone else want to take a stab at it? The people? Close. See, the Bible actually says these are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Now you might say, wait a second. Hold on, wait, time out. How is it that he spoke this to the Israelites, but when you look at the rest of the Old Testament, who were the priests that were actually in charge of the ministry? The Levites. You're right, it was the Levites. But the Levites came after this. So how is it that this was God's plan A, his dream team, and then the Levites are the ones that ended up actually performing ministry? I'm glad you asked. We're going to get there. So what happens after this is that God tells this to Moses. Moses takes his response to the people, and Moses goes back, summons all of the elders of the peoples, and set before them all the words that the Lord had commanded him to speak. This is what we just finished reading. The elders all responded, the people all responded, saying, we will do everything the Lord has said. Let's all say this together. We will do everything the Lord has said. One more time. We will do everything that the Lord has said. That's right. Praise God. And Moses takes that response back to the Lord. Awesome, right? So God says, cool, we're going to set a date. And on this date, I'm going to come down on the mountain, Mount Sinai, and I'm going to show myself in a mighty way. You're going to see me as who I am. I'm going to come down as the majestic God who I am, just so you know who you're dealing with, just so you know that I have power and who you're going to be representing to the rest of the world. So before that, Moses, you need to tell the people they need to consecrate themselves. Prepare for this important time that I'm going to spend with them, because this is going to be their ordination service, where I'm going to expand the pool of priests from a group of people to the entire nation. Wrap your mind around this. In a nation, who comprises a nation? Just the men? Is a nation just men? It includes who? Women and children. So get this, every man, every woman, every child in the Israelite army, in the Israelite camp rather, was going to be an army for Jesus. They were all going to be priests. Now we shouldn't confuse this between other spiritual authority figures in the Old Testament, because there's a law of the firstborn, there's a law of the fathers. Fathers and firstborns in the family, they provided spiritual leadership, but it was to their family, to their siblings. There were these things that in the nuclear family, God had said in the culture, the firstborn of every family, he was the one that led out in the family. That's a whole nother situation, but we're not talking about that. We're not talking about spiritual leadership in the home. We're talking about spiritual leadership and direction to the community, to the larger surrounding unreached communities, to the rest of the world, what we would say. God's original plan was for everyone to be part of this. So everyone says all that the Lord says we will do. And you would figure that this would be the start of a beautiful friendship. Even, as we said, God said in Exodus 19 to Moses, he says, go down and warn the people so that they do not force their way through to see the Lord when I do come down, and many of them perish. Even the priests. This establishes a very interesting point, that there were, again, priests functioning and officiating among the Israelite community before the Sinai event. So God says, even the priests, those who approach the Lord, must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. Spoiler alert here, guys. In the Bible, whenever you see the children of Israel saying, all that the Lord has said we will do, ends up not being the case. I mean, they say, in many cases, just like us today, you have good intentions of doing something, but when the time comes down to it, you're just like, it's not what you expect. And what happened when the day came was something very fascinating. So God shows up in Exodus 20, And it's this amazing, powerful event. There's lightning, there's thunder, there's all these amazing things that happen. And the people see this in Exodus chapter 20. And it says here, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, that's an amazing situation. But what does it say that the people did? Can you read that? Is it too small? It says that they trembled with fear. They see all these amazing things happening. They see the mountain shake. They see this supernatural event, and they're terrified. That's fascinating. But more than that is what happens next. Because it says that they stayed at a distance, the people did, and they said to Moses, their leader, Moses, you speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die. The people stayed what? At a distance. And they told Moses, you go, you talk to God, come and convey to us what he says, and we're going to listen. God's original plan was for who to be a priest? Everybody. But what did they want? They wanted Moses to be their priest. Because a priest is someone who, again, we saw the definition. He performs duties. He approaches the deity and performs for them. And they wanted a buffer. They wanted somebody else to do the work of ministry. Somebody else to be their priest. Moses, you listen to God, talk to us, and we're gonna agree with you. Moses ended up doing that because there was no other option. People weren't listening to him. So he went up and approached the Lord. And from there, it's a long story, but we're gonna get to that. Human nature is a very fascinating thing to me because this story reveals several characteristics of what happens to humans. You know, what happened here when the people said, speak to us yourself and we will listen. This reveals a few things about human nature. One, human nature tends to create distance between themselves, God, and spiritual responsibility. Now, we don't know why exactly the people decided to have, or why the people felt fear, because fear isn't something that you can always control, right? I mean, when I talk to my wife and we say, oh, look, a spider, and she says a spider, and then I run my fingers right along her back like a spider, she gets freaked out, and she says, don't do that, and she slaps my hand. Why? Because she hates spiders, right? You can't always control why you fear things. These people, they feared God, or maybe they feared his power. Maybe it was that they saw this amazing thing and they were like, I'm not worthy. I can't do this. I can't officiate for God. Maybe that was a good thing. Or maybe they saw God and saw this powerful, mighty deity with thunder and lightning showing up, and they said, this guy could very well kill us, so we'd rather not go there. But even in these two situations, this shows us something very interesting, that they either lacked faith in God's character. They either doubted that God was as good as he said he was, or they doubted God's calling for themselves. Because there's a saying that goes that God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. And so when God called the rest of the entire army, the entire children of Israel, and say, hey, listen, I want you all to be the children of Israel. I want you all to be priests. They heard what God said, but they were like, you got the wrong idea, God. Go to somebody else. But that's human nature. We tend to put barriers between ourselves and what God has said. Lord, I can't do this. Lord, I can't. Doubt, hesitancy, in a sense, is an example or a sign of a lack of faith in God. That's one of the things that human nature tends to do. Another thing is to elevate individuals as superstars or superstar priests and offer them limited to no support. You remember what the people said to Moses? Speak to us yourself, and all that you say we will do. Now remember what I told you about when people said that they would do something? What actually ended up happening? They didn't do it. So Moses went and spoke to God, and he came back and told the people what God had said. Do you think that the people listened to Moses? Nah, they didn't. So Moses ended up doing this job because he needed to. There was no one else that would do it. And there's a few things that happen once this happens. The people started abdicating their responsibility to Moses. Has it ever happened to you that you see a position, or you're in like a job or in a board or something like that, and everyone just waits to see what one person says, and then everyone just kind of goes along with it? Yeah. Just tell us what you think, and we'll just go with you. We'll say whatever you think. Or what the pastor says, or whatever this person thinks, we'll just do that. But everyone on the board has a vote. Everyone on the board has a decision to make. They're all leaders. But when you have this idea that you elevate a superstar to a great level, you in a sense abdicate your responsibility if God has called you to be a decision maker. If God's called you to be a decision maker and you're looking to somebody else to make decisions, that's not faithfulness. There's another way that this shows up, which is even more dangerous, is that when we elevate superstar players or elevate superstar priests, we, in a sense, they're prone to thinking that they are superstars, that ministry actually can't go on without them. So there'll be a situation where we'll be like, man, you, pastor, you delivered an awesome sermon, and I'm not here. Pastor Lafitte's not here. Pastor Morris isn't here. Nobody's here. And then we come back, and people say, oh, pastors, we're so glad you're back because things just weren't the same without you. That church was falling apart. You laugh, but I've heard of that stuff before. Oh, things just weren't the same without you. And that's dangerous, folks. It's dangerous because you can get us to think that success happens because of us. That if the church falls apart, it's because we're not there. But if there ever comes a point where Miami Temple is doing something without us and the church is falling apart, we have not lived up to our call as pastors. We're doing a terrible job as pastors. It's not our job to keep the church going. It's not. You may be surprised, but hang on tight. This is going to get worse. Here's the thing. We tend to elevate priests and say, oh, fantastic. But when their jobs are struggling or their marriage is crumbling or their personal life is struggling because they've dedicated too much time to the ministry and not enough time to their home, we're just like, nah. I'll tell you this. I remember this because, this is not in my notes. I remember this because it came up in a talk that I had with one of my mentors. He said, Nelson, you're a pastor. I know you are. But you got to remember, the church is Jesus' bride, not your bride. If you're spending more time with God's bride than your own wife, that's spiritual adultery. Why are you spending more time with someone else's wife than yourselves, your own? And I was like, whoa, okay, yeah. Leaders, if you're spending more time with God's wife than your own spouse, you may have bought into the superstar mentality. If you're not investing into somebody else, so that once you leave, your ministry can continue with someone else, you may have bought into the superstar mentality. Human nature tends to do this. It's not bad, but you got to be aware of it so that you're constantly investing into somebody else. Does that make sense? Finally, your human nature tends to create limits on God's calling to a strictly religious setting. This idea that, well, I have my job, that's my side hustle or my full hustle, and then I do what God asked me to do in church. That doesn't matter how I live out here, because over here I still do my work, I still give tithe, I still participate. No. When it comes to unity and when it comes to life, the Bible doesn't make a distinction between personal job and a ministry job. You are a priest in your home, in your job, you're a priest in your school, and you also happen to have a position in church. It's indispensable. One goes with the other. You can't separate yourself into segments. Biblically, that's not true. There's no such thing in this. You've created a distinction where God has made no distinction. So, once we see that all this happened with the children of Israel, what ended up happening? Oh, this is later on. I went back a little bit. Yeah, it's like that. God shows up, thunder, lightning. God shows up. And people freak out. And they said, Moses, you talk to us. Thank you, God. Appreciate that, Lord. Lord knows how to make transitions. Fantastic. So what ends up happening is that the people don't become Levites. They don't become priests. What ends up happening is that Moses then has to do the job himself. He's currently the only priest in the whole congregation. Sometime later on in Exodus chapter 32, we have the situation of the golden calf incident. Does anyone remember that? Like, people started dancing, and they got buck wild, and they did their own thing. And then Moses comes down, and he sees people dancing, and they're like, yo, what's up? You're supposed to be praying and consecrating yourself. And they're like, man, what's up, man? What are you doing? And Moses gets so upset, he breaks the 10 Commandments, the original version, on them, and makes everyone eat or drink what is called, basically like 10 Commandment milkshakes. He literally ground up the 10 Commandments, mixed it with water, and said, everybody, you got to drink this. Yeah, and the calf. He also grounded up the calf. Yeah. So it was kind of like being a meat eater, but not. So not really the same at all. So anyways, what happened here was that Moses came down and he says, who will stand with the Lord? And there was the tribe of Levi that showed up. And they said, we will stand with the Lord. And they went through, took an axe or took a sword, and they actually struck down and killed many of the Israelites, those that had been responsible for this terrible thing, for the rebellion in the camp. 3,000 people died that day. But because God knew that he couldn't count on anyone else but the Levites ended up being the priests in that congregation. So catch this. What ended up happening was that instead of a nation of priests, God had to settle for priests in a nation. I'll say that again. Instead of a nation of priests, instead of everyone being a priest, God had to settle for certain people being priests in the nation. It limits the amount of people you have ministering from God, wouldn't you say? Instead of having 100 people ministering for God, you have 10. How much more could you do with 100 or with 1,000? So that's what ended up being the pattern in the entire Old Testament, up until the time of Jesus. You see, Jesus comes and he lives his ministry. He invests his life into other people. But you know what happens with his death and his resurrection? He ascended to the throne of heaven, and he became what's called in Hebrews our great and mighty high priest. And you know what he actually says to believers, to Christians, to you and me? Do you remember what the descriptions for Melchizedek and for Jethro? What was the description? That Jethro was a priest and Melchizedek was a king? And the words that he told to the Israelites, saying, you are for me a holy nation. You will be for me this, that, or the other if you follow my decrees. You remember that? Notice what he says in 1 Peter chapter 2 about Christians. He says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people. That's who? That's you. That's you. That's you. All of you are called to be God's priests. You are to be God's ambassadors in the world, in your jobs. You are God's priests, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people of God, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but have now obtained mercy. You can be God's ambassador wherever you are. So when you walk into your job, you are bringing in the atmosphere of heaven to your job. You are representing God in your department. You are a priest in your job. That's crazy. But it's true, it's biblical. You are representing God. You are a mini ambassador wherever you go in your society, in your job. That's what God has called you to do. And I thought, yo, that's pretty cool. What would it look like if there was a church that embraced this, that believed this, that lived it out? Believe it or not, there was a church many years ago that did this. Well, not that many years ago. You'll see. There was a church that was growing incredibly. And there was a newspaper article written about them. They were growing so much. They said, how are you guys growing so much? It was here. It says, how is that you have grown so rapidly, this church movement? Interviewing one of the leaders of that church, just called the elder, says, well, in the first place, replied the elder, we have no settled pastors. Our churches are taught largely to take care of themselves, while nearly all of our ministers work as evangelists in new fields. Every one of our members does more or less missionary work. Last year they made, and this has a description, 102,000 visits to people, 40,000 letters, obtained 38,000 subscriptions to our periodicals, distributed over 15 million pages of reading material, and over 1.6 million periodicals. That's a lot of people. Who do you think this is? Who do you think this church is? Guess what? It's your church. It's a Seventh-day Adventist church. This was back in 1886. 1886. That's just a few years ago, right? 1886. They were growing. The church was growing. It started here in the United States, and it was growing by leaps and bounds, and they caught the attention of people. They're saying, whoa, how is it you guys are growing so much? What's going on? And this is what they said. We have no settled pastors. Our members basically do missionary work. All of us are ministers in our field. That's what's called the priesthood of all believers. There's a Protestant doctrine, the idea that you don't have to go to someone to get your sins forgiven. God can speak to you directly, and God wants you to work directly for him. because you are a co-priest with God. So this church did it. And check out what happened. 1863, the church was established. We had 3,500 members. By 1900, we had 75,767 members. We had about, over those 20 years, about a 20% growth, average of about, we grew about 20%, let's say that. But an average yearly growth rate was 8.9% for those 37 years. I went back and I double-checked this between the services because there was a slight mistake in the first service. 8.9 was the average yearly growth rate for those 37 years. Now, how many of you heard of compound interest? Compound interest is a great, fantastic concept. It's the idea that if you invest in something long enough, it will basically multiply itself over and over again. And, you know, I imagine, what could the church have been like if using this compound interest idea that, you know, the church was growing at 8.9%, what would it look like if we stayed at an 8.9% average growth till today? What would it look like if our church was growing at 8.9% a year since 1900? Anyone want to take a guess? Take a stab at it? To give you some perspective, our church currently has what, like 19 million Seventh-day Adventist members in the world? Catch this. Had we stayed with an 8.9% growth, look at how we would have grown. Boop, boop, boop. So, we're at about 19 million members. We would have hit that mark somewhere between the 60s and the 70s. If things had stayed the same way we were back then, if we were growing at the same pace that we were during those 37 years or so of ministry, we may have had 1.6 billion members today. One out of every, what, 6 people in the world would have been a Seventh-day Adventist? That's a lot, huh? 1.6 billion, is that a lot of people? Is that just me? 1.6 billion is a lot of people. That would have been how many people we would have had in the church had we maintained what we did. And remember, what were they doing before? They said they had no settled pastors. Everyone did ministry, more or less, blah, blah, blah. But look at what ended up happening in the actual percentage rate. These are the actual membership growth rates, yearly percentage rates, the average for 10 years. In the 1900s, it was 3.2%. 1910s was 5.8%, and we were at 178,000. That number represents how many members we had at the end of the decade. 1920, 5.3%, blah, 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 blah. I stopped at 2000, but we never reached that goal again of 8.9% or whatever. We got close to it sometimes, but instead of 19 million or so, we have, instead of 1.6 billion, we have 19 million. And in the United States, specifically, it's a lot lower than this. Our growth as a church here in North America has been much slower than the rest of the world. As of last year, we had about 1.2 million, remember. And I guarantee you that we don't have actually 1.2 million people in our churches. This is just that are on the books, because there's people that have died. Maybe we haven't noticed that they passed away. There's people that have gotten baptized twice in some churches, or they moved and you don't know where the records are. It's a bit of a mess. But think about what could have been. What would have been like had we been 1.2 million members? What happened? What happened? Well, there's lots of factors. I'm not going to pin it on one thing. However, one major shift that happened in the church around the turn of the century, around 1900, was that we started shifting the way that we thought about and did ministry at a local level, and the way that we funded ministry even from the conference. Do you remember they said that they had no settled pastors? Around turn of the 19th century, some of the largest institutions that the church had, starting in Battle Creek, Michigan, started saying, hey, we need our own pastors. Like, we need someone to come and be with us week after week, etc. And so they started getting their own pastoral team, where there was a pastor settled over every church. And you may, if you're from other countries, you may realize that this is also the norm, or this is not the norm, what we have here in Miami Temple. Most of our pastors here, yes, there's 3 pastors, but if you look at overseas, having a pastor week after week in a church is a luxury. You don't have that. I was just talking to a pastor, a friend of mine. We had pastors meeting this week in Camp Calaqua, and he was at his church in in Central America, one of these places, and he had around 37 churches. Just this one guy. Around 30 or 40, there was a lot of churches. And the same thing happens in Africa. I've been to Africa and I see one of the pastors there. He said, yeah, I have about 30 churches or so to myself. I have a big area. And he says, the guy that was here in Camp Kalawak, he says, I only have 4 churches now, and that's a lot better. That's a lot better. 4 churches compared to 37 or whatever, that's great. But you think about this, like we have a church, we have around 900 members or so as a Miami temple. We have 3 pastors on staff. Why? Am I asking you to fire me? No, I'm not asking that. But what I am telling you is that something did shift. And Ellen White noticed the shift. And she said, wait, hold on. I was like, guys, you need to understand. The reason that we have no settled pastors is for a reason. She actually told this to the testimonies of the church. She wrote this, said, God has not given his ministers the work of setting the churches right. No sooner is this done, apparently, than it has to be done over again. Church members, and catch this, church members that are thus looked after and labored for become religious weaklings. If 9/10 of the effort that has been put forth for those who know the truth had been put forth for those who have never heard the truth, how much greater would have been the advancement made? God has withheld his blessings because his people have not worked in harmony with his directions. So instead of having pastors start churches in different places, be a network, growing, expanding, we were content at basically just having what we have right now. She goes on and actually gives more of an emphasis. She says, the greatest help that can be given to our people is to teach them to work for God and to depend on him, not on the ministers. Let them learn to work as Christ worked. Let them join his army of workers and do faithful service for him. My Lord. It says the work depend on who? Depend on him and not who? The ministers. Are you ready for this next one? She says this. There are times when it is fitting for our ministers to give on the Sabbath in our churches short discourses full of the life and love of Christ. But the church members are not to expect a sermon every Sabbath. But what do we get? A sermon. How often? Every Sabbath. I hope you're waking up to this. I hope you're waking up to this. I'm here as pastor of outreach. I'm going to share this. And I don't mean this to be misunderstood. I'll share this because it happened, and I want to share with you what happened. My first board meeting, I have this idea, first leadership meeting, not board meeting, because we call it leadership team meeting. I was in there, and I have this idea that, listen, we're at about 900 members or so. What if, in about 6 years, we had this vision of being at 2,500 members, or thereabouts, going towards that? If we were reaching people by leaps and bounds, if we were 2,500 members, and some of the leaders laughed at that. And again, I don't mean this as a negative reflection on them. However, when I think about the early church, that day when the Israelites were rebelling and when the Levites were established, 3,000 people lost their lives. But when God came in the New Testament and he established the New Testament priesthood, do you know how many people came into the church that one day and were baptized? 3,000. 3,000. And how long? One day. And what I'm saying is that what if we were at 2,500 in 6 years? And that's funny. You know what's funny? Is our lack of faith. And that's not funny. That's deadly serious. I'm a guy, I love to joke around, I love to laugh. But when it comes to God's work, I'm very serious about that. Why have we settled? Why are we okay with business as usual? Content to come into the church and just listen to a sermon Saturday after Sabbath, and if I don't like the sermon because the pastor stinks, I'll go to another church. And I don't participate in ministry. And I'll just do this. And when I don't like things that are going on in the church, I'll move to another church because there's lots of options in Miami. And I can church hop. I can do that. But do I have a position in the church? Do I contribute? Nah, I mean, once in a while, they need it. But what if we were all part of ministry? I think we've settled. I will never forget the embarrassment I suffered in 2004. I was in Antillean, in Puerto Rico. There were Olympics that year, you know that. It was in Greece. And it was embarrassing to be a fan of Team USA basketball because the Team USA from 1992, they settled. They also settled. They had this idea that they were the best and they never trained. And so they sent athletes over there that were still NBA players, but they never worked together as a team. They weren't cohesive. It was just a team of individual superstars. And they just, by the time 2004 came around, we got beat really bad. There's a gentleman by the name of Carlos Arroyo. And I will never forget that name. And this guy standing up trying to block him, do you know who that guy is? You recognize him? That's D-Wade. That's Dwayne Wade. He was like a rookie that year. He was a kid back then. He was a kid. But they put him in a team of players who included Allen Iverson and some other people. And they got beat that year really bad. It wasn't even funny. I was sitting in Puerto Rico. And the U.S. just, their loss just kept on losing. I mean, they were losing. It was like a loss by like 40 points. It was embarrassing. Los boricuas estaban, ¡opa! Eh! Jorge, man, was laughing. Man. He was like, yeah! But you know, you guys are still part of the United States. You know that, right? You know, so it's basically like we won anyway. So, I mean, I'm just saying. But it was embarrassing. We had this team of Puerto Ricans. They came together. Carlos Arroyo was maybe one of the only basketball players that were there. But these were just a group of guys. They came together and they beat professionals. They beat the NBA's best, and they stomped us, and we learned our lesson. Because the U.S. got complacent. They settled for the success that they had. They settled for the success and their laurels, what was given to them before, and they stopped dreaming like the dream team. So in 2008, you know what happened with the U.S.? They retooled. And instead of the dream team, they sent out what's called the redeem team. This was a team of the best. And this time it was Dwayne Wade, 4 years better. LeBron James, 4 years later. Chris Bosh, Chris Paul, Carlos Boozer, Dwight Howard, and even, I don't even know who that guy is over here next to, some guy there, I don't know. They had Kobe Bryant. Kobe, even Kobe, who never does anything, who hardly likes to pass to his teammates. He said, I'm going to join this team, and he passed the ball. The Spirit of God has touched his heart, and he started passing the ball. And they swept the 2008 Olympics. They won the gold medal, convincing fashion. The redeemed team. I think about Miami Temple, what Miami Temple has done over the years. We started most of the Spanish churches in South Florida. I hope you know that. About 22, we started here. We started GMA in 1910. We started Hialeah Hospital. We planted 2 churches and Hialeah Hospital in the 1950s. And I think, why are we at only 900 members? We've been around for a century. Could it be that just like Team USA, we have settled? We're content at this group of people that's in this place. We think we're a big church, and we think that that's okay. You know, friends, when I read what God says in 1 Peter, it says, you are a chosen generation, his royal priesthood, a holy nation. Who's he talking about? He's talking about you. And I think about what the potential this church has, how much it could reach for God if every one of our members were to have this idea that I'm a priest in my home and I'm a priest in my job, that I minister for God wherever I'm at. I'm a priest as I'm working out. I'm a priest as I'm handling deals. I'm a priest as I handle children in the classroom. I'm a priest. I'm an ambassador for God wherever I go. If we were to train and equip ourselves to be God's ambassadors, how much more would we do? How much would our own personal lives be enriched? How much more would our faith grow once we start trusting and leaning on God rather than on just the leaders in the church that have positions? The dream team in the church, I would say, was the early church. Because they bought into that idea. They said, yeah, every one of us are going to be ministers. We're going to minister for God. And they ministered in their homes, and they ministered in the synagogue, and 3,000 people were baptized that first day, but more were added on each day. But you know who God has called to be the redeemed team? You are God's redeemed team. You have been called to do something special, to show God's presence in the world. But the question is, do you actually believe that? Do you believe what God says about you, about your potential, about your calling? It doesn't matter your past, your history. Yes, I know that, and God knows that. That's the biggest thing. God knows who you are. But yet He's called you for something bigger than yourself. He says that I don't call the equipped, I equip the called. You are part of that redeemed team that's meant to win Miami for Christ. Don't be content with 2,500. Be like LeBron. Say when he came to Miami, we're not going to win 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6. Did he win 7 titles? No, but how many did he win? 2. How many has Lafitte won? 0. That's Lafitte. He's not here. I'll tell him this. LeBron James won 2 titles with the Miami Heat. And then he went back to Cleveland Cavaliers and he won another one. And I admire LeBron because he put team before his own ego. When he came to Miami, people were like, oh man, he's not going to join Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh. He's the man. He's a superstar. Why is he going to join this team? Because he realized that the team's mission was more important than his own status. What would it be like if we became like LeBron James? But now I'm talking serious. What if we actually believed like LeBron James? What if we believe that the mission that God has given us is bigger than our own individual empires? What could we do for God? I went to Southern Adventist University, and I'll close with this. And Southern Adventist University didn't have an NCAA team where they would send people to different schools and we would compete against them. And a lot of people didn't like this because they had an intramurals team where you'd get your own team together and you played against students from the school. And people were saying, well, why is this the case? Why can't we just play against everyone else? And our president at the time, Gordon Beats, had a town hall meeting where they were asking him lots of questions. And this question came up as one of the questions. I'll never forget his response, and I wrote it down, and I want to share that with you today. He said this: I would rather have a sports program where I can walk into a gym and see 10 people watching 100 people play instead of watching 100 people watch 10 people play. Statistically speaking, it's said that about 80% of the work in churches is done by 20% of the people. And I don't know if this holds true to Miami Temple. I'm still new here, so I'm figuring this out. Is that true? I don't know. But I hope that's not the case. What would it look like if we had a church where 100 people came out and supported what was going on? And I know it's the case because I have more than 100 people going and showing up and helping at Tropical Elementary. So thank you, church. I know you're showing up. But I'm not content with that. I'm not content with just doing services to Tropical Elementary. This is the beginning of many things. I want Miami Temple to be a creative lab for ministry. I want us to do amazing things that the church hasn't seen before. I want us to dream and imagine what could it be like if we were doing things as the church originally did it, the early church. If we were to think biblically, God has called you to do something. And I want to give you some actual things to do. Friends, if you have any position in the church right now, here's your job, your task, your homework. Find someone to personally invest and train in. If you have any position in the church, but you are not investing in somebody else and training them, you are not doing your job. If you don't know how to do that, come to see us. We'll teach you how to do that. Find someone to invest into. If you have no position in the church, ask yourself, why? Why? That's not something I can answer. That's only something you can answer with God. Ask yourself why. And if you don't have an answer, ask us how. How can I be involved? How can I be a part of ministering to God's people on God's team? We have these connect cards. And if you're not on anything and you'd like to be a part of it, or you just want to talk to somebody about something, I invite you to fill this out. We have general ministries in the church that we can put you on, but like I said, you're not limited to those ministries. We want to do things that the church hasn't seen before. So if you want to minister for God by creating movies or ministering to dogs or something, I don't know, be a part of it. Do something for God, because you, friends, are God's dream team. You are His redeemed team. God has called each one of you to be ministers, to be ambassadors, to be priests in His field. You are God's dream team. God isn't calling anyone else. So I want to invite you to believe that to lace up your shoes. The world is waiting on you. The world is counting on you. It's time to lace up your shoes, step on the court, and get to work. God bless you this morning.